Well, thank you all for being here. My name is Dave Elving. I am the interim executive director here at San Francisco Camerawork. And we are excited to be hosting the second event of our forecast series of events. And we haven't really framed it this way, but we've developed a little series of talks all about found photography and vernacular photography. And we began it last week with a talk with Irene Reese and Rana Young and their use of found imagery. And you can see their work in our forecast show. And we're really excited to continue it tonight with Kim Beil and Carlos Chavarría. Carlos, you know what? I'm going to try that again. Carlos just gave me a tutorial on how to say his name. Carlos Chavarría. I did it better in backstage. In any case, Carlos and Kim Beil, we've rather than a traditional art talk, we've invited some of our forecast artists, scholars like Kim, to join us and talk about using archives and found imagery in their work. So we're excited to continue that today. And tomorrow, we'll conclude that series with a talk from our Juror's Choice Award winner from Forecast, um, Rachel Fine-Smolinski, who also uses found imagery in her work. So we're really excited about this because it's not just one-on-one. We get to listen to these two thinkers and creators share their perspectives with us. So as we begin, I want to take a moment to acknowledge that as a San Francisco organization, even though this digital world allows us to be together from all over the world and certainly all over the United States, here in the Bay Area, we like to acknowledge that we are on the native lands of the Ohlone people. So we want to acknowledge that even as we are excited to be here in San Francisco and to be with all of you from points beyond. We're excited to get started today. Carlos was born and raised in Spain. I'm not going to read the whole paragraph, but as we were talking behind the scenes, we were reminiscing about Reiko, where Carlos was the artist in residency. He was chosen as one of PDN's 30 new and emerging photographers to watch in 2016. And there's lots of other awards and things you can read about on our website. I think the most important accolade is that he is one of the artists chosen to be a part of our forecast exhibition, which you can check out on our website right now at San Francisco Camerawork. Kim Beil is an art historian who specializes in the history of photography and just in the midst of the pandemic published a book, Good Pictures, A History of Popular Photography. And it looks at 50 stylistic trends in the medium since the 19th century. So we asked them to come together and share we asked Carlos to share his work and his thoughts about working with found and vernacular photography. And we asked Kim to share her perspective as well. So we're going to start off with Carlos, then we'll hand it to Kim. We'll come back and have both of them in conversation, and we'll have some time at the end for questions from the audience. You can add those questions to the chat at any time. One last advisory before I stop talking. We are recording the event tonight, so we welcome you to turn off your cameras and unmute your microphone and ask a question, but you don't have to. Anything you type in the chat isn't recorded, and that's another way for you to interact with the artists tonight. I've spoken enough. We'll get started. Carlos, we'll hand the platform to you. Thank you for being here tonight.
Thank you, guys. Well, good evening to everyone. My name is Carlos Chavarría. I'm a photographer living in San Francisco, California. First of all, I wanted to thank SF Camerawork for having me, and also the jurors for selecting my work. I'm thrilled to be here speaking with Kim and all of you about found photography, its influence on my work, and also to discuss my project, Dust Misfires, that is part of Forecast, the exhibition that's currently on view at SF Camerawork. So I'm gonna share my screen. Okay, so I would like to begin speaking a little bit about my background and how I became interested in found photography in the first place. I'm originally from Madrid, Spain. I moved to the Bay Area in 2010. I think it was around 2012 when I actually first came across a box of old photographs. I was in this little town called Sebastopol. It's a town known for its antique shops. So I was there with my wife, hoping to buy some furniture and some artwork for our new house. And, you know, coming from Spain, I had never seen a place where you could actually buy old photographs. So this was new to me, and it literally blew my mind. I spent a little bit of time that day going through images. These are some of the images that I found that day, that first day. And then I came back the following week by myself to go through the entire box. You know, this was like, was the beginning of actually like trying to go to different places and researching where I could find more of this. I'm going to list a few of the things that made me interested in fan photography. First of all, I was fascinated. I was, really intrigued and really, yeah, this really, it blew my mind, the materiality of the photographs, like all these, their physical presence. All these different photographs had different sizes, different, textures. There was a certain smell to it. So it was actually a sensorial experience, and I thought it was great that he also forced me to get out of my house, get in my car, and drive to different places to find these images and have actually a physical interaction with photographic materials. Secondly, I thought, from a didactic point of view, it was the perfect way for me to learn about the country, popular culture in the United States, photography, and the relationship throughout time. And then I thought this is a huge, source of inspiration that's outside of all the online, overshare content that we are daily exposed, all the photographic trends. Like in my mind, this was the least pretentious and the least conscious approach to photography. So there was a sense of visual innocence in the images. And it really, made me start appreciating the medium in a different way. Start appreciating the medium in a more basic, innate aspects of the medium, right? Like something really, really basic. It just really, shocked me in the first place. So this process of image hunting became more and more important to the point that it also, was as important as the shooting part. So I started putting together these sketchbooks that I actually still do today. Usually I do it once a year. And this is a place for me to, to lay out ideas, just experiment and explore the possibilities of the photographic language. Sometimes these little sketchbooks become the seed of, of larger projects that I develop afterwards. So while, looking through all these photographs, there was one category of images that drew my attention from early on and that I really liked. These were the photographic accidents. I really liked them because I thought of them as a symbol of, the perfect symbol of popular photography. They really, represented this element of serendipity that's so connected to photography and that I like so much. While also, speaking about the democracy of the medium. So I started picking, errors from different eras, all different kinds of errors. These are actually some interesting ones. I think Kim will be speaking more about this a little later, but it's interesting how Kodak, their effort, trying to teach people how to take, correct pictures, how to be a good photographer. So, you will get your images back from the lab with these little stickers, almost like a teacher giving you, the grades of your test, giving you an F and being like, hey, here's what you need to do better, to be a better photographer. So, but well, within these photographic errors, I became especially interested in what I call misfires. These are presumably accidentally shot images that contain very little info, if any. And some of them are actually really abstract. It's just like, one color or one color palette. And yeah, I was really attracted by them. I thought they looked really good. And even some of them had this little feeling of like explosion almost, right? Like you see this like little like magical dust, almost like, sparks. So I thought the term misfires suited them pretty well. Embracing this, classic analogy of the firearm and the camera, the act of shooting, the trigger and the shutter. At the same time, I had been wanting to make a project that showed, the process of image hunting. These are screenshots, jailed screenshots of, different places that I go to find images. Sometimes I thought these places were as interesting as the images that I was picking. So I really wanted to find a way to show these places. And as you can see, these places are filled with all kind of stuff from different eras, right? Like it's visually speaking, they look like the opposite of the misfires. They look really, really busy. So what I started bringing my camera along with me every time I went image hunting. And I will spend, some time photographing, and then I will go through the boxes of images. These are some of the contact sheets of the images that I took there. These are the images that I refer as dust in the project. So, you know, once I connected this idea of the emptiness of the misfires and the busyness of the dust images, I thought that was the way to go. That was the way to proceed. I thought it was a great juxtaposition of both elements. I think it will work really well to do this portrait of the process. And also, when I made that connection, you know, it instantly reminded me to a body of work that I had studied in the university back in Spain many years ago. And this was the work of British artist John Hilliard. For some reason, this body of work got stuck with me for all these years. And I just thought from a compositional point of view, I think it's brilliant what he did, right? Like this kind of image by partially obstructing the one part of the image, it does two things that I think are amazing. One, it makes you stop. It makes the viewer stop at the image and pay more attention. Like, especially nowadays, that's a great attribute to have, right? Like to actually, okay, you know, what is this? And second, it forces you to look for details, to scan the frame of the picture. You know, like I think the way the human brain is wired, our eyes always tend to go to the center, looking for meaning, try to make sense of the composition and try to make sense of what's in the image. In this case, by obstructing the image, like you are forced to really scan the frame of all the picture, looking for information, try to decipher what's behind that screen. So, you know, the content is completely different, but I was really happy that my project will resemble a little bit this body of work that I love so much. And there has been a, you know, so it's a little tribute, you know. The work of Volker Evans obviously was also in my mind when I was doing the project, not so much for his photographic approach, that is quite different from what I did, but more for the significance of his work. I lost count of the amount of times that I found Volker Evans images in the most random places in this country. So it really gives you an idea how embedded his work is in the collective imaginary of America. It's like his work is vernacular, you know, in like capital letters. So, you know, I thought it was important. I think it's an important part of this project. And there is even a little tribute to him in one of the collages, if you look closer. And of course, Evidence by Larry Sultan, Mike Mandel. I'm sure you all know this book. It was a great influence, not just for Dust Misfires, for all my work. This book really changed, you know, the way I look at photography. And I think this is still as relevant and influential, or even more than it first came out in '77. So, you know, I always have it present. You know, it's a masterpiece. Now I want to talk a little bit about the process, step by step, like of the execution of the project, the materialization of the project. So since this image hunting process is so manual, it's an in-person process, a physical process, I wanted to stay true to that. So I wanted to do all the steps by hand, which I did, except for the scanning of the finalized collages, so I could share them with all of you online and with the world. So also the idea of this was like, at the end, what I wanted to create was an object, kind of like an artifact that you could find in one of these places, a box full of photographs, pretty much. So I started picking the misfires by hand in all these places. I will put them in a box and then also in a paper sleeve. Then I was photographing these places with a medium format film camera. And I was making color prints in the traditional darkroom at Breako, we talked about before. And I was making prints, 11 by 14 inches print. Then I will attach those prints to a backing board. And then I will use another board to make a mask for the misfires, to place the misfires right in the center. Using dry mounting tissue and a mounting press, that's how I created the physical collages. But then I came across this cloth, this fabric that I really, really liked and kind of resembled these sparks or like magical dust that I mentioned before. So I bought a few jars and I took it to a binder, and he created this clamshell box for the project. Now I'm gonna start flipping through the actual images of the project, all the collages. So I decided to include these introduction page that is, with a really direct, straightforward description of the project. So when you open the box, where you kind of get an idea of what you're going to see. When it came to pairing the misfires with the dust images, it took a while until it actually felt good. I was thinking, sometimes I was making decisions based on color. So it was like chromatic associations, chromatic decisions. Sometimes it was more of a formal decision. Like, for example, in this one, if you look closer at the misfire, you can see these little like colorful particles kind of like elevating, kind of like floating, going up, kind of matching the butterflies in the top right corner of the dust. So these are small connections that I made, hoping that the viewer, once you look at the project, you kind of make those associations. And again, these are 11 by 14 prints. So when you see them in person, it's actually nice to, go closer and look for details. I wanted to highlight also this quality, descriptive quality that photography has, especially like using medium format, with the strobe. Like, it's really, there's a lot of detail. Another thing that I was super excited about doing with this project was this idea of contextualizing the misfires. So in other projects like the sketchbooks, for example, I tend to use found imagery in a different way. It's more in a sequence, in a more poetic, narrative way, if you will. So for this, since what I wanted to do was a portrait of this image hunting process, I thought it was really important to show where these misfires were found, to put them in context. And at the same time, that allowed me to, to physically and literally bring together my two main practices as an artist, the shooting and the image hunting into an object. So that was extremely exciting to me. This is the last collage. And that's it. Thank you so much, guys, for listening. And back to you, Dave.
Thank you, Carlos. I have a quick question because I know it's something that we're going to talk to more as we join the conversation with Kim. I didn't know about the influences to the composition of your work. One question, just briefly, that I'm sure you're asked a lot. What's the collaboration for you with these unknown photographers? Where does your work begin and their work begin and end? I can tell that my audio is not working very well. I hope that made sense.
Would you mind repeating it? Sorry.
It's the simple question is, where does your work begin and where does the work of the archive begin? What's that relationship like?
Well, I think it's a cycle, and that's something that I realized while doing the sketchbooks. When in the first 2-3 years of collecting imagery, I realized that found photography was feeding. Found imagery was feeding my photography, and it was shaping the way I was photographing. So it's a pretty like classic, straightforward approach. But like looking at all the imagery, you realize how like history repeats itself and how like approaches. I also work a lot in editorial photography, so I find myself like photographing a lot of the subjects that I find on found imagery, like business, people or different events and stuff. So it's great. It's just a cycle, a self-feeding cycle. Sometimes I find myself photographing in the same way, that pictures that I found, and sometimes I found images that remind me to my work. So it's like it's like a full circle kind of process.
One more question. Sylvia had the observation about the number 13.
Yeah.
Why is that significant to you?
So it wasn't like I wanted to do 13. What I wanted to do is I wanted to make a pretty concise, project that it was, I work with different, doing different projects at the same time. So it can be easy to get carried away, by one project or this. So for this idea, I wanted to do something very concise, make the point, and show it in a, in a short, amount of collages in this case. Like I think if I had done a series of like 45, 50 collages, I think it will lose some of its power, because once you've seen the principle, the formula, of the project, I think 12, 13, you know, it's enough. And also thinking I wanted to be, like I said, an object. So, you know, I couldn't make a giant box with like 50, you know, collages. To me, it was like a more, okay, close project. I'm going to do this. I'm going to execute it this way. And, you know,
Yeah.
I also love all these, you know, like the Diane Arbus, like the box with 11 photographs, 13 collages by John Gossett. There's all these, you know, references that I had in my head too, that I thought I wanted to do that kind of project, like a more concise, you know, direct project.
An even baker's dozen, as they say. No, I think that makes sense. You've defined the scope, and it forces you to make choices about your archive, which I think is great.
Yeah, totally.
That I know we'll have more time to come back and talk to the work. Uh, I'm excited to hand it over to Kim Beil. Kim, thank you for being with us, and thank you for sharing. I know you've just published this book. I'm really excited to see your perspective and insight on found and vernacular images. So please, it's we're excited to have you here. Thank you.
Great. Thanks, Dave. And thanks, Carlos, for your presentation. I'm going to share a presentation as well. Here it is. I'm really so pleased to have had the opportunity to think about this work. And already, Carlos, in your presentation, there are so many more connections. So this is really an exciting conversation for me. The funny thing is that at first it would seem like Carlos's work is kind of the opposite of mine, because my book is called Good Pictures, and Carlos's work is focusing on these found photographs that were like mistakes or misfires or accidents. But really, those are both two sides of the same coin. Fortunes in photographic style are easily reversed, as Carlos was just saying. And in my research, I've found that what how-to books define as a good picture is constantly changing throughout the entire history of photography. So often one generation's good picture was a previous generation's mistake or failure. And I love, Carlos, what you were just describing about these errors from different eras. That's something that I see a lot in my research too. So in this book, Good Pictures, I trace 50 of those stylistic trends through 175 years of photographic practice. And surprisingly, to those of us familiar with trend cycles on the internet, the cycles that defined trends in the 19th century were almost as short-lived as they are today. So I'm going to take you on a really quick tour of some of those reversals in the next 15 minutes. 175 years in 15 minutes. Let's go. So most photographic rules appear so natural that they're thought of as nothing more than the necessary techniques that result in good pictures. Those rules might include the rule of thirds, or the more subtle and changing rules like the best angle for portraits, which, you know, just a couple years ago was always like this, right? As soon as you start to see those examples of rules throughout the years, as you do in how-to books, it becomes clear that what was once considered the best can soon be considered a total failure, or at least entirely embarrassing, like the pictures you had on MySpace in the early 2000s, or Duckface, which was much more recent. But to take a less kind of personally incriminating example, I think the 80s use of warm lighting for these food close-ups, like you have in the McDonald's photo on the left, versus the flat lay and the cool lighting of food pictures on Instagram in the mid-2000s is a great example, because it shows these two pictures that were both considered good in their time, but now one of them seems almost objectively better than the other. In fact, it's just a matter of stylistic preference. We can't say that one is better than the other, except within their time. So in 1912, Kodak began publishing a how-to series called How to Make Good Pictures. And the series ran through the 1990s, although it was renamed How to Take Good Pictures in the 1980s. So these books described how to use your camera, when to take pictures, and most relevant to Carlos's work, common mistakes or misfires. So what I find most interesting about these guidebooks is that what was once a bad picture or a mistake can become a good picture just with the passage of time. Those mistakes were rediscovered by later generations of photographers and used as aesthetic effects. We might be most familiar with the examples of the 60s and 70s when art photographers started deliberately incorporating amateur accidents into their art, such as Friedlander's use of the photographer's shadow, which was, of course, something that was frowned upon throughout almost more than 100 years of photographic practice. Or you have John Baldessari's series, which recreates the scenes from a how-to book, and in this case, shows what not to do. You don't want a palm tree sticking out of your head, although I'm so glad that John Baldessari does in this case. So the guidebooks would say, watch out for distracting backgrounds, but these artists and others in the late 20th century used what we now refer to, and what Carlos is pointing to, is the snapshot aesthetic. To make their work seem authentic or to express a rejection of the standards of fine art photographers who came before them. So Baldessari and Friedlander are really working against the group F64 or the completely pre-visualized images, and instead embracing these amateur marks like palm trees in your head. But the reuse of former accidents and mistakes isn't limited to the 20th century. Photographers have mined the technical failures and mistakes of previous generations, at least since the 1850s. So here you see the example of vignetting, which was a popular portrait style patented in 1849 by John Adams Whipple. So vignetting, as most photographers know, was originally the result of using too small a lens to cover the plate. So Whipple pioneered the use of this oval cutout that he would wave around in front of the lens during the exposure to recreate the look of the too small lens, but to do so in the portrait studio, and so that he could make it the same every time. The vignetting effect was also inspired by popular drawings of the time. So portrait drawings that only included the bust, so shoulders and head. But they were definitely borrowing from a mistake of the medium. So we were talking earlier about Reiko. It really is so important to have some access to making photography in a manual way, because these kinds of accidents, right now, they just seem like another filter that you can apply in any camera editing app. It's the thing that darkens the corners, but it actually has a mechanical origin in this lens size or the use of a vignetting oval. So Kodak's manuals, just to fast forward, I guess 100 years, Kodak's manuals tried to warn photographers away from these mistakes of framing and lighting. So, they publish manuals that show the mistakes, but also they put stickers on photos that will teach you when you get it back in the mail or from the drugstore. So in this manual from 1951, it says, now let's look at some fumbles. So these are photographic fumbles. So some of them are really familiar, and some of them you'll be familiar with from Carlos's discoveries too. So underexposures, and some of them are compositional failures. Tilted camera, overexposure, camera movement, double exposures, bad lighting, dirty lens, the subject partly cut off. You get a bad background, that's the Baldessari, or a subject out of focus, or the lens obscured, which is a nice way of saying either camera strap or a thumb in the frame. And that could still happen, actually. Not even my iPhone can fix that. And so this is also a 1950s guidebook, including some color photographs, which introduces a whole new range of mistakes that amateurs can make. On the bottom right, you can see the problems that we used to have not all that long ago, using the wrong kind of film in the wrong lighting situation. So I think most of us are in a kind of mixed lighting situation where you are right now. I see a lot of blue glow on people's faces and maybe surrounded by warm tones outside. So Zoom has not gotten as good at color balance as iPhones and other digital cameras. Hopefully they're listening in and they'll fix that. So this is actually one of my favorite examples of a former failure that was repurposed for aesthetic effect. Motion and rapid motion especially has been a challenge for photography since the very beginning. But by the 1950s, even amateur photographers were able to still rapid motion with flash. So almost immediately after these consumer grade flashes hit the market, photographers began reintroducing motion blur into their pictures and doing so deliberately. So I call this motion blur, which is actually the result of panning the camera to follow a subject that's moving quickly. The technique is borrowed from filmmaking, so it does look like you're moving a movie camera. But the photographer chooses a slow shutter speed that allows the background to blur while the moving subject appears to remain sharply focused in the middle of the frame. So you can see the comparison at the left, the blurry car, or at the right, you've got a blurred background and a seemingly still car speeding through the landscape. The panning trend surged in popularity in the 1950s and the early 1960s. And you can see in this image that not only was the photographer Max Legrand panning with the car, but the Dunlop logo in the background has an artificial blur added to it. So it was so popular that designers were incorporating it into their work as well. And here again, you see an illustration, advertising illustration from Life magazine in 1955 that adds the panning blur to a Chrysler advertisement, and a nice comparison between the bad kind of blur at the top in the Austin Healey advertisement and the good kind of blur at the bottom. So the idea in this, the comparison of these two images is on the top, it says this is the Austin Healey 3000 that didn't win at Sebring. But that's like the track car that you would take for a race, and it's clearly too like wild and crazy to drive yourself, especially if you are the woman who's driving it in the bottom. And so they control the blur with the panning technique and make this car, they cut this car down to size. It's no longer the scary car at Sebring. It's one you could take home. So this use of motion blur was justified as everything from a more natural way of perceiving motion to a fitting aesthetic for the cultural upheavals of the 60s. At the time, no one described motion blur as a response to the overly sharp and still photographs enabled by consumer flash. But I think this progression is really important. Only when the photographic technology has overcome a particular limit or a perceived failure are those accidental effects reintroduced for aesthetic gain. Like most trends, the overwhelming popularity of motion blur led to a critical backlash in the 1960s. Magazines here, US Camera, are debating the battle over blur, and others are wondering if it's a creative tool or a sloppy technique. So popular photography also joins in, and these photographs are made by the glamour photographer Peter Gowland. So there's enormous anxiety in photography over technique and the limits of artistic freedom, right? Like what's a mistake versus what's an intentional aesthetic effect? And I think blur really highlights that. So as this article concludes, it is all too easy to blur a picture through sheer incompetence. So in order to have an artistic choice, you have to do it intentionally, not incompetently, even if the end product looks the same. Even so, in how-to books like this one from 1957, photographers are still being warned about motion blur, even as in later pages, they were taught how to create it intentionally. So almost all of the other camera errors listed in this book later became intentional aesthetic effects. So we've got light streaks, double exposures, like we've seen in Carlos's collection, and also what they called at the time chopped off heads. So that's number one here. There's a picture of a baby where the frame cuts through the baby's forehead. But this also became a popular aesthetic. So in the 1960s, getting in close to your subject and making, either just the eyes here or a nice tight crop. This is by Jenny Delaccio, square, meant to fit on a record album cover at the time. So there were all these ways in which rules were being broken by commercial and art photographers, even as the amateur guidebooks were still teaching people not to do this. So here, these are Bert Stern photographs from the Art Director's Annual from 1959. So at this time, you've got both the intentional aesthetic effect and the accident kind of on the scene coincidentally, and really not talking to each other. Maybe it signifies this gulf between amateur and professional practice. So we move forward just a couple years. This is a 1972 Kodak manual which is important because it's the first to include a Black family on the cover. So all the way from 1839, or maybe the origin of Kodak, if we look at the beginning of the 20th century, this is a long time until we start seeing people of color both on the cover and in the pages of the how-to manuals. And that's not at all to say that people of color weren't photographing. They absolutely were. There were some of the best portrait photographers of the 19th century were Black portrait photographers, and yet they are not represented as being photographers or being subjects in any of these books. So here in the 1972 book, of course, more technology equals more problems. These are flash problems, exposure problems, glare spots, as you can see on the right, or a red eye, which might look familiar to you, not from your family snapshots, but from Jürgen Teller photographs that became popular in the early 2010s. So many of those mistakes listed in the Kodak manuals go on to become intentional effects. And most recently, the use of on-camera flash, which has long been marked as a sure sign of amateurism, was picked up by Jürgen Teller and others in the early 2010s. And I think it signifies immediacy and casualness. Pictures that use on-camera flash bear a strong association with amateur snapshots. Although, like many former failures, this too is very deliberate. So fashion and celebrity photographers like Jürgen Teller were using on-camera flash to signal access, I think, as if the pictures were made casually, like a snapshot. And this is one of the early ad campaigns to use this effect for Marc Jacobs in 2011. He also made pictures in a similar style for Celine in the same year. But those pictures have this association with on-camera flash photos that were amateur snapshots all the way from the late 1950s and 60s and onward. So here you can see like the brownie star flash has the flash clearly attached to the camera, and it creates this really dark shadow behind the subject on the walls. So this outline, sometimes referred to as a ghost, that, as one of the guidebooks says, needs to be exorcised from your pictures. Advanced amateurs, however, at the time, and many of the guidebooks were teaching this technique, they used a flash cord and either were taught, I mean, somebody's gonna put this in the chat, you're supposed to use a bounce flash. And so they bounced the light off the ceiling or a nearby wall or reflector so that the light was more evenly distributed and you could get rid of those ghosts or those looming shadows. Again, here, Teller for Celine in 2011. The pictures feel a lot like those amateur snapshots, as if Teller was backstage at the fashion show or at a gallery opening from the white walls. So I wanted to just give you some of this history to look at how these misfires might have figured into other photographic practice at the time. The misfires that Carlos has collected are often exposure errors. And in the middle of jumbled personal archives that include newspaper clippings and trophies and books and boxes and letters and other photographs, the misfires are entirely void of information. They're empty, like Carlos said. But that absence also makes me strain to see those other objects in more detail. And so I'm really gratified to know that that is exactly what you're going for. You know, there's almost a desire to like push the photograph aside because I'm so desperate to know more about what's happening like down in the corner here. Who is this? Or what are those trophies? So the more I look at like these rolled up photographs or small snapshots, some of which probably could also be dubbed bad pictures, the more I realize that they too are missing important details. I still don't know who those people were or why those objects were saved. And maybe most poignantly, why they were eventually abandoned. And they bring to mind for me, Deanne Arbus's famous statement that a photograph is a secret about a secret. The more it shows us, the less it tells. So I'm pretty confident, or I feel pretty confidently, like Carlos does, that these pictures were misfires. But like past trends, it's hard to understand what their original viewers saw in them when today it's so easy for us to simply classify them as bad pictures. So I'll leave you with those ideas, and I'm eager to expand this conversation and hear more from Carlos.
Thank you, Kim. I'm eager to just hand it over to the two of you for conversation. because I know that you've exchanged some questions and you've corresponded about things that I don't know about yet. So I'm excited to hear. I thought what you were raising about the way photography is supposed to be as we are taught in its formal application and the way those things are applied commercially reminded me sometimes of, particularly when I first started being a mentor at photography. Carlos and I were both mentors at First Exposures here in San Francisco. I recall the first time I saw that Instagram was replicating mistakes so that it would kind of give a legitimacy to your feed. And then that came full circle for me. I went over to Glass Key, our favorite local photo supply store here in San Francisco, and they were selling film to people who had just kind of discovered the medium that had been pre sort of treated with light leaks. And I found that sort of the easier and more elegant, not elegant, the more efficient photography gets, there seems to be a hunger for these mistakes. And I wonder if as you were gathering these materials for your book and thinking about these things, if you could comment a little bit on that. What is it that seems to attract us to mistakes, such that, to your point, what used to be a waved to make the vignette, a photographer was, you know, replicating what used to be a mistake, and then it became intentional. We see that on Instagram. It was amazing to see pre-screwed up film that you could buy at a film store. Where is that going? Where does that come from? That we sort of aspire to these mistakes.
Carlos, do you want to answer that?
Yeah, sure. Sorry, I thought this question was for you, so I was actually looking for my.
I was thinking of you, Kim, but I am happy to hear what you think, Carlos, and maybe you can both respond, and maybe then just go straight into the questions you have for each other. But you put into historical context, Kim, something that goes far further back than I realized the first time I saw a filter on Instagram or this pre-treated film.
Yeah, I can say quickly that I think mistakes are exciting because it's a way of introducing chance and randomness into a practice that's otherwise, very technical and limited. It's a way of changing your medium, and I think people embrace that because one, mistakes arrive unbidden, and sometimes you can choose to see that it was a good thing, that kind of is collaborating with you. I almost think of chance as a collaborator in the photographic process. And I'm calling it chance, not error. Carlos, how do you feel about it?
So yeah, I think it's also, like you said, it's one becomes a trend, but I think it's so interesting about the mistakes. In photography, like any other discipline, when you push the medium to its limits, to its boundaries, that's when interesting things, show up, and like revealing aspects of the medium show up. So I think the mistakes are part of that, are part of like, actually paying attention to, as you said, not going to the usual route, and then, by mistake, by a happy accident, something happens, and people start like kind of embracing that and paying more attention to that, and that becomes a new thing and something that's acceptable, but I really think it's part of this, kind of like push the medium to like the ways it's not supposed to work, or the ways it's not supposed to be seen, or so like any other discipline, like you really go to you push it to the boundaries, and sometimes you find interesting stuff like out of the ordinary, and yeah.
I think what I want to highlight a comment that Kent just put into the chat, where he said mistakes can be seen as evidence of humanity. And I agree with that. I find it fascinating that now, instead of it being a happy accident, these are things that we're applying with intention in filters and so on. And just that relationship of what's found, what's an accident, is so interesting. I don't want to spend too much time on this because I think we could definitely go down a rabbit hole. I know you both have prepared some questions for each other and have kind of thought it through a little bit. So I'd love to just hand it to you to kind of share the conversation that you already started with us.
Perfect.
I'm curious to understand what you think. Why do you think these pictures were saved?
I think it's it's a technical reason, I think, honestly. You know, like back in the days, people didn't have digital cameras, so they couldn't look at the screen and see, oh, you know, I made a mistake, I'm gonna delete this. They were stuck with the mistakes until they got the film, the prints from the drugstore. Then they had the choice of including those in the photo album or not, right? But the images were there, you know, like they were a record, even if they stayed in the paper sleeve, you know. There were a record of them, and I'm happy it was like that, because it, you know, it reveals this, like, you know, magical way of using them, you know, that I think. I wanted to ask you, you know, I'm curious to know, what do you think about, you know, in this like instant gratification culture that we live, you know, nowadays? Everything is so automatic, everything is so, like, you know, the phone, you don't really need to like learn and how to book anymore, because the phone does, you know, almost everything for you. So I'm wondering, what do you think about that? If that maybe, you know, made us a little more lazy and less thoughtful about the photography process than our previous generations, and if those, like, you know, those technical advances actually like leave less room for happy accident, for mistakes, and therefore to develop, like, you know, photographic trends based on errors.
This is such a great question. Thank you so much for inspiring me to think about this. I hear two questions. One is about the laziness, maybe. And I think people spend, I would guess that the average photographer, like an amateur photographer, spends more time taking pictures and working on their pictures now than they did ever in the past. Like you're describing, you know, a drugstore packet of film that you might have gotten back in the 70s or 80s. Like you just took the pictures, and maybe it took you 6 months to get through that roll of film. So you've got like multiple holidays and a bunch of pets at the end when you have leftover film, right? But that was it. That was the only time people were taking those pictures. Today, I think people really work on their pictures with filters and, you know, are taking, I mean, there's some astronomical average of how many pictures you have to take to get a good selfie. I won't even tell you how many. But
yeah, that makes sense.
I think people do spend a lot of time working on their pictures today, even if it's not in the dark room. And then the second half of your question about happy accidents is so interesting to me, because I think we can't even see how the accidents that are happening in our camera are good yet. Like I can tell you what my phone does that I don't like. I don't like night sight or night vision. It always brightens things too much. And everyone here in San Francisco who witnessed the fire skies a couple months ago knows that our cameras couldn't handle that because they automatically brightened the situation. And I think likewise, if you're taking a picture of a candlelit dinner, you don't want it to look like the interior of Target. Like the camera doesn't quite know what atmosphere is. The other thing the camera always does wrong, or the phone camera always does wrong, is cropping. It only recognizes landscapes with horizons and people who are standing upright. And so those to me sound like accidents that we haven't quite yet embraced. So watch for those.
Yeah, I think that makes sense, actually. Yeah, that probably will be like something that, you know, future generations will look back and, you know, and be thoughtful about that. Makes sense. Yeah.
You mentioned earlier that you wanted to make sure that the mistakes or the misfires you saved were placed in their context.
Yeah.
Because a lot of use of photographic accidents or amateur photographs is often decontextualized. And what do you think's at stake in that? What?
You know, I think photography has this amazing quality, one of my favorite ones, and especially fan photography. And it's this, you know, this ability of raising questions, right? When you see an image that, you know, a found image and you don't know who took it, why took it, like there are so many questions, you know, that one found photograph can raise. So I think that's what, just imagine, you know, if someone finds a set of 3 pictures of the same, you know, of the same situation, and they will choose only one to show, you know, to like include in a project or whatever. The act of choosing what you show, it's already, you know, like, you know, it really highlights this mysterious, you know, like element that photography has. So I think that's a big part of that, you know. And also, like, for me, in my case, in the misfires, you know, I think for this project, this kind of misfires, like, you know, the emptiness of content was perfect to contextualize. Just imagine if instead of the misfires, I have had other images that you could actually like recognize some shapes or something, like it will, you know, the attention will go immediately to that image, you know, like precisely the emptiness of these misfires is what makes them so good to contextualize, because you can actually, you know, put them in the center and then the attention goes around the misfire. You know, there is not a lot of description in the misfires, so your attention instantly goes to the dust images, so to what's around, you know.
Yeah, I think we read them really differently in context. You know, I think about where they came from and who made them, and again, why they were saved. I think I love the combination.
It's part of the mystery, you know. Again, it's like not just what's depicted in the image, but just the act of, like, you know, finding this random image among other, you know, and it's one of the parts that attracts me most of found photography. This like endless, you know, mission of like going and picking things and just finding surprises, you know, finding the unexpected, looking for the unexpected. And sometimes, you know, I have some found photographs in my archive that I am still like, you know, wrapping my head around them, like trying to make sense of them. Or, you know, some of them, they look like a still from like a, you know, crime movie, or some others are like just so random, you know, and especially knowing that there was no artistic pretension most of the times, you know, we don't know, but we assume, you know, the majority of those images were taken in a really naive way, right? Like, you know, I'm just photographing my family, or I'm on holidays, and then these like magical things happen, you know, and that's one of my favorite things of found photography. And that's, I think, one of the reasons that it's like, it's so, you know, it's asking like to decontextualize and to work in a narrative, you know, and like to really play with the meaning of association, you know, of like different images. I just think, you know, it's one of my favorite parts of found photography, that aspect of like, you know, the mystery, you know, it's so, I really, you know, I love that.
Hop in briefly. Wait, before you go, I want to acknowledge a couple of things that happened in the chat, and then I want to give it back because there were some cool issues raised in the conversation you just had. Kim, you were talking about accidents around formal photography. Carlos, you were talking about the way we use our phone. It seems like a lot of the technology of photography, the tools that are intended for us to use, it's almost like they've been chasing this sort of formal sense of perfection. And our phones now automatically sort of adjust things for us in order to make it simple. And let me make sure I can catch people here, but Nana and Jean and others, we were talking about how in order to capture the reality of the bizarre day we experienced here in San Francisco in the Bay Area a couple months ago, the day when everything was orange. Well, if you took out your phone and tried to take that photograph, it wouldn't work because our phones did not register that you were outside. They didn't register that this was sky. And in order to take an actual photograph, we had to sort of break the rules on our phones. And so now that this technology is kind of making choices for us, prohibiting accidents, it feels like accidents are less prone to happen. Like the material that we're so entranced by and that you've both spoken to feels like it's becoming rarer. And I wonder if you can just expound a little bit on that. You were starting to speak to it, but what's happening to accidents now that our devices and our proclivity to review and edit? I thought it was really interesting, Kim, that we're spending more time editing than we did before. Does this mean the end of accidents?
I think we'll just look for them in a different place. I don't think that there are any longer accidents that the photographer created. You know, it's not, well, it could be my thumb in front of the lens. That's still possible. But I think most of the accidents that will become trends are those that the camera and its software have added to our pictures. So one thing that I can think of immediately is the poor job that iPhone does at identifying and cropping and rotating pictures as we want them to actually be cropped and rotated. There is a trend among Instagram and Facebook users to crop or to rotate their profile photos. which I think, is kind of rejecting what Facebook wants. And so there's a subtle revolution there, but I think it also speaks to how frequently we see things that are cropped and rotated incorrectly. So we just have to look elsewhere for the mistakes. I think we look at the machine for the mistakes instead of for the naivete of the user.
Totally. I think those, I'm just like, I started thinking about the mistakes, the kind of mistakes like them that happen more often with our phones, right? And I'm thinking, same as you pocket call someone, that happens also with images, like you maybe leave the camera on and, then you have a bunch of like pocket pictures, So that will be maybe one category. And also another one that's like kind of funny to think about when you're taking a picture, but you're actually doing a video, and people stay completely still, like thinking it's a picture, it's actually a video. So I think those kind of mistakes, will kind of like take a life of their own in the future, and then maybe, they will speak about, how is photography in these times and how different it was and how we were using our phones, But yeah. I wanted to ask you something else, Kim. I'm also thinking, what do you think about this like concept of like the perpetuity of images? How is that going to change, for future generations, and in popular photography, what is headed? Like, do you think we're heading to an era where the only printed photographs we're going to be able to see are going to be in billboards, magazines, newspapers, just because I don't think people are printing images anymore. I think the screen is the main platform for everything. So there is, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't think there's people printing a lot of images from their phone and putting them in a photo album, So how does a photo album is going to look if it's going to exist, in 2035? And also, and this is it's a very different question, but what do you think about like, the power that like, social media companies have? They own our memories. You know what I mean? Like in so many years from now, they're gonna own all our memories. They're gonna be the owners of everything. So it's kind of scary to think about it, and what are we gonna do with that? What do you think, we're going in that sense?
Yeah, I'm not one for predicting the future, but I'll try. Photo albums in 2045. I think you're right. We don't have printed photos, certainly not in the quantity that we used to. But I, as a historian, I would be really grateful to be able to see all the pictures that someone took. Because, as much as we think Monica in the chat is saying that she deletes her mistakes or, chooses the good picture over the not good picture, not everybody does that. And so I think we're going to end up with, I'm thinking of like Robert Frank, the great Robert Frank show at the National Gallery that included all of his contact sheets. We're going to have everyone's contact sheets if those technology companies decide to keep them. So if you're relying on your Amazon Photos Drive or Google Drive to keep your pictures, like what happens if an antitrust lawsuit breaks up those companies and suddenly it's too expensive to bother storing people's pictures? There are lots of things that could happen to our pictures if they are only held by one person or one entity. I know there are lots of implications of privacy too in the second half of your question, like what happens when our family photos are shared. And I can only say that it's going to be related to advertising, and so maybe it's not all that distant from the printed billboard. Those billboards will be speaking directly to us because they know what we're looking for because we tell them through our images.
Yeah, totally makes sense. Yeah, it's as a father myself, I just think like how my son is gonna think about his memories. Like how is he gonna keep his memories, his photographs? Like, is it gonna be, I'm gonna show him a photo album, and he's gonna be like, what is this? Like, he's not even gonna understand the concept of it. Like, would you even print these things? Like, what do you need to, they're taking a space. It's just like, so, and it's one of the reasons it also, draws me to go to these places and like I said, I have a physical interaction with photographic materials, because I think that's going away. You know, I don't think like the print, you know, I don't think it's even like a thing anymore, you know. So it's I don't know, I'm confused about that.
Yeah, you know, I have to admit, since I've only seen your work online, I didn't know that there was an image like stuck to
physically
the image. Yeah.
Yeah.
So I have a different experience of them, right? Like my desire to push it aside would be only that much stronger seeing them in the gallery, because there is something
totally
on the front.
Yeah, and it's you know, it's actually, that's what I mean. It has like a tactile quality to it. That's interesting to see in person. Thanks pandemic for this. But you know, it's like some of the misfires are glossy. My prints are matte. You know, some of the misfires, they still have tags that you could actually scratch and like, you know, take the you know, the dirt out of them. So I think that's all, it's part of the same thing, you know. And I really, that's why I wanted to make an object, make something that you have to actually touch. You can, you know, you can have a, you know, it has a presence. It has a three-dimensional presence, you know.
It sounds like your inspiration there is kind of speaking to a couple of these comments too, that if your desire was to make something physical, tangible, we've got two comments, one from Kent and one from Jean, talking about the youth and a desire to make physical objects again. So I know that certainly Instax film is really popular, as are making printed books from Instagram photos. But that's actually sort of leads me into another question, because as much as Instax film is popular, I think it gets its greatest use being photographed and then put back on Instagram. It's, you know, shown where it is. You got a little bit of tabletop and you got the whole border around it. So this reminds me of a conversation in an exhibition catalog of Linda Connors. And she describes a conversation that she had with Emmett Gowan about taking pictures of pictures. And Gowan says there's something in the taking, the reproducing of a picture with another picture that increases its power. And I wonder if you feel that too. Are you?
Yeah, you know, it's funny, like going back to the slide that I had on my presentation, the penny picture display, the Walker Evans image, the iconic Walker Evans image, you know, I think it's so, you know, it's really attractive to photograph photographs. And in that case, like just by seeing all the photographs at the same size, right next to each other, it just creates a little world of its own. And it's talking about typology, you know, it's like there are all these different relations that show up, you know, by comparison. Like, you know, when you're photographing, in my case with the misfires, when you see some of the prints in the dust images, like you get a sense of what I talked about before, you know, the different sizes, the different textures, you know, so it really creates this like relation about all the photographs that are inside the photograph. So it's pretty meta, you know, but I think it's great. And it you know, it just gets a different life, you know, that before, like it's not the same as scanning a picture and put it on the screen, that's taking a picture, you know, of that picture in the place that you found it. Like it's going to be read in a complete different way. So I think that's a really interesting, you know, approach, like how different, how rich that approach can be, you know, depending on how you go about.
Mm-hmm. I can only imagine that it's inspired by seeing a thing that feels three-dimensional but only shows you a two-dimensional space. And so we like put it in a three-dimensional space and then we flatten it down again. It's a wonderful hall of mirrors.
Yeah, totally. And also, like, I really love this idea of the photographic souvenir, right? Like thinking about the, you know, the found photographs that I find. Some of these people took these images, like the act of taking these holiday pictures, they weren't really different from like buying a t-shirt that said I was in Cabo, you know? It's like, it's kind of the same approach. It's like, I'm taking, you know, this memory, I'm doing this so I can have a memory of this sweet time that I had, right? So, you know, when I'm picking these images, sometimes I feel I'm taking souvenirs from myself. You know, these are souvenirs from my practice, and these are like little memories. So it's like, it's really interesting, I think, the materializing, you know, aspect of photography, or really like taking a picture of something and just, you know, you don't need that thing, you know, like it's a really interesting. I love the concept of like you know, photograph as a souvenir.
And maybe related to souvenirs, do you ever buy other objects at these flea markets? Do you feel like you want to take stuff home and rearrange it, or is the picture enough?
I want to take everything. The problem is living in this city, you know, like space is limited. So what I end up buying is always like photography related stuff. So, you know, sometimes I find albums, so I will buy the whole album because, you know, even though it's missing some images, but you can see, like I have this photo album that I really like. That is, it's called, I think it's called Birds and Clouds from My Backyard. Simple as that. So it's just like images of like, I think it's called animal life. So you see some birds, you see some like little, you know, lizards, and then clouds. So it's like such a, you know, basic, naive, you know, concept that I love it. So I will take the whole album with me, you know, instead of like getting the photograph. Sometimes I just buy boxes, you know, all boxes that look cool to put my prints on. Or, you know, paper sleeves, you know, like I showed you guys in the presentation before. There are so many different objects, you know, so many like random things. And I wish I had my own studio, you know, with like big space so I could, you know, so I could actually buy and have more of them. But yeah, I mean, you find amazing stuff, really, like stuff that, you know, I didn't even know that existed.
Do you see any connections between your art practice and your editorial work?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's all part of the same, you know, like I said before, like when I'm photographing, like in my mind, I don't detach myself and say, okay, now I'm doing the editorial, I should be shooting this way. It's all like part of the same, like, you know, by forcing myself to like really look at these images, like instead of like, and you know, I have to have an Instagram just because I make my living as a photographer, so I have to do it. But it's a constant battle I have with myself of like not looking at like, you know, Instagram, Facebook, Tumblr all the time, because unconsciously that's gonna influence you. So I'd rather be, you know, looking at images that have nothing to do with, maybe, you know, it's other photographic trends, but it's such a mixture and such a like weird that it has nothing to do with that. So I think like I said before, that has shaped the way I photograph. And it's that I, you know, and it's like, you know, embracing little accidents and embracing like classic approaches, you know, like to photography. So yeah, to me, it's all the same. It's all the same part. Even though sometimes I'm doing a project, like I'm thinking about a project that I did about trains, like train travel in America, and like these people that get together to do like organize, you know, like riding trains, all trains, and doing like the same experience. So on that trip, for example, I gathered a lot of like archival things they had there, like brochures and like all, you know, pictures of the train. And I mixed those with my own photographs. The magazine didn't do it, but I did it in my website. So I always try to have, you know, my editorial work, my sketchbooks, my other projects, to have connections that are like, you know, they're intertwined with each other. So, you know, one thing kind of takes you to the other one, and there's like this correlation.
Cool. Well, I want to encourage everybody to check out your editorial work too.
Oh, thank you.
Fantastic work.
Thank you
so much.
Should we
open this up to general questions now?
We love that.
People can pop them into the chat. I wonder, Monica, you wrote a lot in that paragraph. If you'd like to perhaps ask the question directly, you're welcome to. We can also return to it. I want to...
Go ahead.
Oh, go ahead. Was that you, Kim? Or was that Monica?
That's Monica.
Oh, go ahead, Monica, please.
I'll jump in. I was actually writing a new question. This is such a great conversation. Thank you both for this. It's wonderful. As Carlos mentioned, this idea of photographs as souvenirs, and that's an idea I'm kind of obsessed with. And like the fact that so many of our photographs today are like aide-memoire, right? Like where did I park? Or just something you saw on your phone and it's a screenshot. And Kim and I have talked about this a little bit before, but I think I'm just curious what you think of the status of those photographs, if they're even pictures, or, I mean, how should we think about them in this context?
There's nothing here.
You want to go first, Kim?
Oh, we have talked about this many times before, and I still don't know the answer. I think, okay, yes, they are photographs. These things like, you know, not even something you'd put on Instagram, but like, here's the prescription I want you to pick up for me at CVS, or here's a receipt that I need to get reimbursed for. Those might be the photographs of the like future history. That it's so fascinating to see them mixed in with the rest of our lives too. So yeah, I think the photographs.
I totally agree. And, you know, I don't know, it's because like I said, I make a living, you know, taking pictures. But if you look at my camera roll in my phone, it's more like a notepad, you know? So I'm just taking pictures of the, you know, the street meter that has a code that I can pay my parking with my phone. You know, I'm literally taking notes with my phone, like the images, you know, like I'm using the camera on my phone. And sometimes, you know, I've been approached like, do you do phone photography? Like, and I'm always like, I'm sorry, like I'm not capable. I'm just using it as a notepad, really. You know, I'm just like taking pictures, like you said, you know, what I'm missing, or, you know, like these things that I have to remember. Or, you know, I think what I have more in my phone, more than pictures, are screenshots. So when I'm reading the news, I'm, you know, on social media, I take so many screenshots. And I think that's actually like that's the use that I do with the phone, more than taking pictures. You know, it's like capturing like pieces of information, especially now that with social media, it's so easy to see something, and then if you lose track of it, impossible to find. You know, like because someone posted it and you don't know how to find, you get lost in this rabbit hole of like information. It's like too much information. So yeah, I think like, you know, these like photographic notes kind of thing, you know, they have potential to, you know, someone's gonna be doing something with them for sure.
It's such an interesting observation. You know, it wasn't that long ago that the idea that you would waste your film taking images of your parking spot or a wine bottle, that, like, can you imagine taking out your point and shoot camera
Yeah.
having to, like, these things we take for granted. I think that's really interesting. Stuart, a person who I know has made some prints in the darkroom.
I know too. Hi, Stuart.
Feel free to ask a question. You're still on mute, Stuart, but go ahead.
Sure. Hang on, let me just cancel this out. Yeah, so I didn't understand misfires, sure, when you were initially explaining the work, but what was dust? What is that about? Is that a part of the work as well? Dust?
Yeah. So the dust images are the images that I took of the places where I found the misfires. I call them dust because that's basically what they're showing, you know, dust laying on like all objects. So yeah, dust and misfires, dust is referring to the prints, the images that I took, you know, the larger images in the collage. And misfires are the found photographs.
The misfires, okay. So why did you call them dust, Carlos? What was the reason there?
Just to give you an idea, every time I go image hunting, you know, I have it in my car. I have a bunch of gloves, like latex gloves, you know, because these places are filthy. You know, these places are full of dust. These places are like, you know, and not all the places look the same. Like you can go to like a posh, you know, you can go to like Petaluma or Santa Rosa, and like you go to an antique shop and it actually looks nice, and you have the Victorian dress in a mannequin. But some others, they look like a hoarder house, you know. And that's what I thought. It is so interesting. This like, you know, how busy and how full of stuff. And also there is like an analogy, you know, when you're going to these places, you have to sometimes like move stuff to make your way, you know, to get to the box of photographs. And when I'm taking, you know, when I'm like looking to the photographs, it's the same. There's so many images and, you know, so much information that you have to like make your way until you find stuff that you like. So the reason to call them dust, it was, you know, it was a descriptive way of what you find in these places. The dust images are the images taken in the places where you find the misfires that are full of all objects covered in dust.
Yeah, well, I think that really is effective because not only are you wading through dust, but all these objects are in effect detritus. It's all essentially breaking down. Things are melded. These are all things that people have gotten rid of. They know what nobody wants. It's the rubbish of the world that you're immersed in. So it's a ruined landscape in a way in which everything is breaking down and melding and being reduced to its very basic components. And I just wanted to confirm that's what you had in mind. And I think that's really good. I like that a lot.
You're right. Thank you so much, Stuart. It's so good to see you.
Yes, you too.
You, Stuart. I'll let you both get back to it. We did have a question from Matt about found filmography. I think, Carlos, you mentioned one of the mistakes that we still make today is you're intending to take that family photo, but it's on video, and now you recorded this awkward moment. I think, found photography is sort of a function of the photography of an era. I think Matt's question about a found filmography or potentially artifacts that we haven't thought of yet as this technology kind of goes forward. Uh, for both of you, can you speak both to, beyond photography to filmography, but potentially, I'm thinking of the other artifacts we kind of collect potentially, like we don't get plane tickets anymore, but I know people who keep their digital plane ticket stubs. Back when we used to travel and could leave the house, right? We have new kinds of artifacts that I think we encounter, and Kim, to your point, that we might discover. So yeah, I'm wondering if you can speak to different types of materials that you both might be writing about or working with in the future.
I love this question because I'm fascinated by how old film feels different than old photographs, particularly family photos, including things that have me in them. So looking at a found film of myself has that element of death that Bart describes in Camera Lucida. Like, it always seems to me like it's something that's going to come up on the 11 o'clock news. Like, there was this girl, she was young at one point. And I don't feel that way looking at old photos. So I think that is maybe a generational change that I've associated the use of found film with, or not found film, but old family film with, like missing persons. And I'm just much more familiar with seeing found photographs of family in other kinds of contexts. Maybe I'm the only person who feels that way. Carlos, how do you feel?
I come across so many VHS too in these places. These are full of it. The thing is, like, I can only, get to so much. Like, I only have so much time, But, it'll be interesting to actually pick those VHS, take a look. And I'm not talking about, commercial movies. I'm talking about a VHS with a sticker that says, summer 76 or, summer 84 or whatever, So I'm sure, it has to be amazing to actually explore that idea. And what also was thinking is like, so if these places, these like jar sales or like, salvage jars, flea markets, like if they keep going, there's going to be a point where what you're going to find are going to be hard drives. So are you going to actually plug the hard drive and go dig into everything that's there, And that's, we're talking about video files, photographs, text, everything. So I think, it'll be really interesting. And I don't do much, I don't do video work myself, but I think it'll be amazing to explore that idea and actually like, kind of take an approach to like, make something new with old footage. I'm reading some questions.
Yeah, that's one's for you.
Oh, sorry, my microphone is off. Usually I like to pop in and make that transition a little easier for you. Let me read it aloud for the group. And I think this maybe will be our last question. I'd love both of you to weigh in, maybe share any final thoughts, and then we'll start to wrap it up. I'm sure everybody can see it, but Kurt asked, Kim suggested that future historians might collect the misfires made today from digital capture. And this is kind of what I wanted to follow up with the question I asked before. How will they find these mistakes? Should we start collecting, old and discarded phones? I think you started to speak to this with discovering hard drives. I'm wondering what might the medium that you're collecting look like in the future, and how much you use it, or have you thought about this yet?
Yeah, go for it, Kim.
Yeah, Carlos, you said finding hard drives. I think that's absolutely likely, not that far from now. But good luck finding the connectors that make it possible for you to open those things up. But secondly, I just heard a wonderful story about the Enron emails. So a bunch of emails from Enron when it was under investigation during the trial. And so all these personal emails became available publicly at the end of the trial. And I think it's entirely possible that we could end up with a corpus of family photos from, I don't know, like presidents who are accused of wrongdoing, and then we suddenly have access to these materials because they're revealed in a court of law. So there are lots of ways that things that we think of as private can end up in public hands. And I think the legal system is one way that might make that possible.
Totally. I think it also goes back to like the power that social media companies have over this. You know, like you see data breaches, you know, in many cases. So it can also happen with, you know, with our personal images, our personal files, you know, that they can be exposed. So, and I wanted to respond to Monica's question in the chat. I'm gonna read it out loud. In editorial photography, it seems like there are so many micro trends, like particular kinds of lighting or pastel colors. You mentioned avoiding Instagram to be overly influenced, but I'm curious if there are any photographic trends that you hate that belong in Kim's book. You know, I try to not hate too much, you know, but there's a specific thing that kind of bothers me when I see Instagram and like some hashtags. Doesn't bother me, but I just think it's a waste of time. Like the, you know, hashtag say film, shot on film, film only. Like kind of like you see all these like contests that are only for film photographers. I should film myself, but I think it's such a narrow-minded way to go. Like the important thing is the approach that you take. You know, I've seen amazing work taken with a digital camera and, you know, not so interesting work made with film. So it's all about the person that's behind the thing, you know, like the camera or the whatever you're working with, you know. So like everything, you know, everything that's like mainstream, sometimes it's like, you know, not so interesting to me or not so like intelligent thought to me. I don't know. But that's one of the things that every time I see it, it's like, what's the difference? What's the point? You know, is the work good or not? Like, what doesn't matter if it was shot on film or unless the project, you know, the shooting, the film shooting is like part of the statement. It's like a really crucial part to understand the process. Otherwise, I think it's irrelevant.
I feel like if we had more time, we could go on and on about film and not film. And I find it so interesting now. I think Gene mentioned this. I think about young people who are shooting on Polaroids. I love that there's still an industry for film. I do think there's this gravitation toward creating something physical, and yet I think by and large, people who are buying on film are often scanning it. And I think that just opens up another whole thing that we could talk about. And I hope we get that opportunity. Carlos, Kim Beil, thank you so much for being here today and
thank
for
you guys.
Your thoughts and your perspectives with us. It's so cool. We really, really enjoyed it. And it was really, for me personally, I loved that you were able to talk to each other and I just get to hang back and listen. It was super great. And thank you so much. I want to thank everybody here for coming. This is Camerawork. We can't be in the gallery, so gathering digitally and being together is pretty much what we got now. So thank you all for being here. And I do want to highlight, join us tomorrow evening. We will have sort of the third in our trilogy of talking about found images, working with archives and other materials. We'll have our Juror's Choice Award winner, Rachel Fine-Smolinski. That'll be tomorrow night at 6 o'clock, same time as this conversation was this evening. And of course, that is Pacific. You can find out about all the events we have coming up, including next week, Monday, the 23rd. We have another forecast event with Brittany Cathy Adams, Rachel Fine-Smolinski again, and Jacqueline Wright, presentations of the body in self-portraiture. And of course, our November Members Critique is coming up on November 24th, this time with Johnny Chapman, an artist who is featured in our auction and is doing some really cool work. You can find out about all this stuff on our website. That's sfcamerawork.org. And while you're there, you can become a member. You can see the events that are coming up. And of course, we rely on your support. So please, if you're not a member already, we'd love for you to join. And we would love to see you at these upcoming events. As usual, I want to thank Christina Graber for helping to make this and everything else at Camerawork possible. Thank you for being here. Thanks to all of you who are coming. I want to give a shout out to Erica Gentry, our board member, who was in the house And I want to thank her for being here. And thanks all of you. We hope to see you again soon.
Thank you.
Thanks again.
Bye, guys.
Really
Good
awesome.
night.
Thanks, everybody.
There's
Bye.
Erica. Thanks, Erica.
Thanks. Students, see you in class.
Oh, and thank you. Thanks, Erica, for bringing the crew. Bye, everybody.
Bye. Have a good night.